Let me turn then to a discussion of three of the issues that I think are useful for us to consider when trying to understand a bit better why it is that justice is not the best concept, moral notion through which we should consider how we interact with one another and how we deal with fundamental problems of evaluating and redesigning our social institutions. Let me begin with the issue of dealing with past injustice. This has been a substantial issue for a number of years. In philosophical terms, for the last nearly 40 years, there's been debate about what are the responsibilities that we have for rectification of past wrongs. This has proven to be no less difficult an issue to resolve philosophically than it has been politically. Why is it the case that this has proven so difficult? Essentially, it's because people disagree about what justice requires. But to look a bit more closely into this, we'll see that there are a number of respects in which people disagree, even though it may be the case that most people recognize that wrongs have been committed in the past and that many of those who are the descendants of victims of past injustice continue to suffer and experience wrongful conduct themselves. Why do people disagree about what justice requires? Well, in part, in motivational terms, they disagree because it seems to make them responsible for the wrongs that are committed. If I'm to learn that I'm the descendant of a slave owner, and I see about me the descendants of slaves, if I'm told that I'm responsible for the wrongs committed by the slave owners in the past, and that I have a responsibility for the well-being of those who are the descendants of those slaves who are now themselves suffering, or even perhaps if they're not suffering, I might feel that this burdens me with a kind of responsibility, and for that reason alone, I might reject it. But aside from the raw motivational question, it might also be that it's a very difficult problem to solve philosophically or theoretically, because the lines of responsibility are difficult to draw. To say that I am responsible in some way for the injustices of the past is to make a claim which is not easy to establish, not simply because it's necessary to show the ethical reasoning involved, but also because it's necessary to draw the lines of responsibility, to show why it is that had that injustice not been committed in the past, things would have been different, not only for me, but also for others, those in particular who are the descendants of past victims. Sometimes this is a problem because we simply cannot make plausible assumptions to what would have happened in the intervening period, particularly once 1, 2, or 3 generations have passed. It's anyone's guess what would have been the outcome of anyone's actions on his or her descendants or on others related to those descendants. But in part, there's also a problem of, very broadly speaking, identity. By this, I don't mean to refer to Derek Parfit's famous non-identity problem, in which he notes that in normal human circumstances, um, the descendants of any person or persons is hugely dependent on the point of conception. And should circumstances change, very, very different people might have been born as a result of changes not only in partnering, but also changes in the timing of conception. If that is the case, some people argue, had it not been for the past injustice, people in the present would not even be alive. But that is not the issue that I want to take up. I'm going to simply leave that issue aside. The problem of identity I want to address is a somewhat different one. This is the problem of determining who are the people responsible for the injustices of the past, and who are the people who are the relevant victims of the injustices of the past, the wrongs of the past. And the reason that this is difficult to establish is not only that we can't successfully be sure of the probable course of action as the result of the wrongs of the past, but it's also that the descendants of those who are victims of the past may themselves occupy a whole range of different positions and statuses, indeed identities, depending upon how the present has unfolded. Some of them may simply have been the product of mixed marriages between the descendants of victims and the descendants of perpetrators of wrong. Some of them may turn out to be people who have succeeded and been showered with advantages, perhaps through their own efforts, perhaps through luck. Some of them may be people who are the descendants of immigrants, or intermarriage between immigrants and the descendants of past victims. So identifying who are the relevant descendants of the victims of the past is going to be a tricky matter. It's no less difficult when we look at the question of who are the descendants of the perpetrators of injustice in the past, even if it is the case that we can attribute responsibility to them for the sins of their forebears. It's not clear to what extent their forebears are straightforwardly those who are the committers of crimes. For example, many of the descendants of perpetrators of past injustice may be the descendants of many people. There may be one distant relative who was guilty of wrong, but it may be the case that 7 out of 8 or 15 out of 16 were entirely innocent of any wrongdoing. To what extent does any connection with a past wrongdoer inculpate one and make it justifiable to attribute responsibility for the welfare of those who are the descendants of the wrongdoers of the past? So the problem of agency here is a tricky one. Who is responsible and who is the descendant of a victim to whom recompense is owed? But there's also another aspect to the question, which is to think about this not only in terms of individuals, but also in terms of groups. Because while we could look at the descendants or if we could look at the descendants of either the victims or the perpetrators, as individuals, but we could also ask about the descendants who might exist as groups of people or institutions, just as we might look at the perpetrators in the past as groups of individuals or as institutions. Which way should we think about it? If we're looking to rectify historical wrongs, should the relevant agents be persons, individuals, who are the victims or who are the agents? Or should we think about this in terms of something quite different, which is to say in terms of groups or societies, or even just simply generations? Now, this is a set of issues that has proven very difficult to settle politically, but also very difficult to settle philosophically. And it is not surprising that this is so, because there is no philosophical resolution possible that does not in itself involve making assumptions that are themselves highly contested. It's not something on which we readily agree. It's not that there's no case for addressing the concerns of the descendants of past wrongs, but to invoke the language of justice becomes problematic, because once justice is invoked, it suggests that there is a strong case to be made, a strong case to be made for attributing responsibility to some and to asserting the existence of rights or claims on the part of others. Now, it may be, some have argued, that it is possible to address this issue as a matter of justice, even without making those very, very fine assumptions or judgments about victimhood and responsibility for the committing of wrongs. For example, some have argued that we should recognize the fact that some people have benefited from the perpetration of injustices in the past. So on that account, for example, even those who have immigrated to a country like, for example, the United States, which had a tradition of slavery for hundreds of years, now themselves, while they were not in any way inculpated in the practice of slavery, even if only through their descendants, nonetheless now benefit from the traditions of slavery in the past, which have made the country what it is and made it a country from which they have been able to benefit as a result of migration. But the problem here is that even this issue is not one that's easily settled, because after all, if one thinks, in this case, of the institution of slavery, so widespread was it throughout the world that not only did slave trading and slave practicing nations in Europe, South America, and North America benefit from this, but so did a whole range of people across the world, given the extent of international trade, given the interaction of human beings everywhere. If that is the case, the responsibility for benefiting from past injustice is something that has to be sheeted home to everybody. But if that is the case, it becomes difficult then to see this as an issue that can be addressed as one of justice, such that the claims of some against the claims of others can be made clear. Now, my only point here is that if this kind of matter cannot be settled clearly, to try to turn this into an issue of justice, to use the language of justice, might simply be too strong. Because in the end, the claims that people might have cannot be settled on the grounds of justice. at least not without some parties to the determination simply rejecting the idea that justice was done, whichever consequence is the outcome and whichever side of the equation the parties involved are. Again, none of this is to suggest that issues of past wrongs and the legacy of past wrongs should go unaddressed. There may be many reasons for addressing them and many ways in which the issue should be addressed. To take one example, it seems to me that the continued existence of statues of those who defended slavery or who bought and sold slaves can rightly be seen as, at worst, an insult to those who are the descendants of those victims and who themselves have continued to be victimized throughout the 20th century up until the very recent present and even continuing today. That is an issue that certainly can be addressed. The long-term consequences for people who are the descendants of various kinds of wrongs, including slavery, may well have special cause for our concern, because we know that in general, the outcomes that they've endured are somehow indirectly connected to the wrongs of the past. So even if we cannot say with precision what the injustice were, who was the relevant perpetrator, or how the wrong was perpetuated down the generations, we surely have enough evidence to say there are things that we need to do to address the condition of our fellow human beings in the present. But to make a claim that this is a matter of justice and to try to address it in this language, while in many ways very understandable, for it sends a very powerful message, in another way it also has the disadvantage of raising expectations and hopes in a way that may not turn out to be sustainable. The outcome of this might not be one that makes for a more secure or harmonious environment for both the descendants of past wrongs and for the society more generally. Let me turn from this issue of past injustice to a slightly different case. This is the issue of intergenerational justice again, but in this case, the issue is how we do justice for the future. For this too has been the subject of much philosophical attention over the last decades. And once again, John Rawls has been an instrumental figure in bringing this issue to philosophical attention in his theory of justice, when he drew attention to what he called the just savings principle and asked the question, what do we owe future generations? What do we owe our descendants? Once again, I want to suggest that the language of justice is not well suited to engaging in this question, even though I don't want to go so far as to deny that we should treat the future as a matter of indifference. But very much depends on how far into the future we look. If we look to the immediate future, to our own children, or perhaps our obligations are quite strong and reasonably clear. If we're looking ahead 2,000 or 3,000 years, then the future is simply beyond our comprehension. And trying to manage the world in such a way as to be able to ensure certain kinds of outcomes in a millennium is beyond our capacity and an inappropriate subject for moral reflection including reflections in terms of justice. So it's that intervening period that we need to be thinking about if we ask whether thinking about our relations with future generations is a matter of justice. I think it's not a matter of justice because it is very difficult, if not impossible, for us to figure out what justice requires of us for our descendants. Here are some options that often crop up in debates about justice for future generations. One thought is that what we should do is try to make them happier, or at least as happy as possible, and ideally not less happy than we are. Many utilitarian philosophers think in these terms. Another well-worked set of concerns is that somehow we make sure that we leave the planet in a healthy condition so that future generations don't have to suffer from inheriting a planet that's in some way in poor shape and unsuited for them in their efforts to live a good life. Some want to say in similar vein that what we owe future generations is that we not consume too much of our resources, leaving them with too little. However we understand those resources, we need to save for future generations rather than consume everything. This is what Rawls suggested when he talked about the just savings principle. But the problem here is that all of these suggestions make a number of assumptions which are difficult to sustain. Most importantly, it suggests that the people in the future will share our values, at least to some degree, but perhaps to a significant degree. And secondly, it assumes that they will have preferences that are not endogenously formed. That is to say, we are assuming that what they want or what they prefer is somehow not the result of the environment in which they have grown or emerged, found themselves, but somehow independent of this. So that what we've got to do is make sure that they have an environment which is going to suit the preferences that they have that are not somehow the product of their interaction with that environment. As it is, we can't know either of those things. We can't know what their preferences will be, what values they will hold, nor can we know what kind of environment they will live in that will produce those particular values. But even if we could design that environment, we would have to assume that the preferences they have to some extent are shaped by that environment that we've created. But equally, if we don't create that environment because they're too far into the future, we can't know what kinds of effects or relationships there will be between that environment and their values. In general, the point I'm trying to make is that we remain enormously ignorant about what people in the future will value, and we tend to assume that somehow the values that they will hold are not going to be the result of their adapting to the environment that they have, whatever that environment might be. If, for example, they find themselves in a world of greater scarcity than ours, perhaps their values will be ones that are consistent with that. If our concern is for their well-being in terms of happiness, well, that environment may be no less conducive to happiness because it is the environment to which they've adapted. Now, none of this, I hasten to say, is not to try to suggest that we should therefore not think at all about what kind of environment exists in the future and think it would be acceptable to leave future generations to inherit a nuclear wasteland. But beyond that, it's difficult for us to know what exactly people will desire, how those desires will come about. But the other aspect of this, and something which is much less noted in the literature on intergenerational justice, is that we don't know to what extent, for example, the values to which they will cleave will tend to be, say, material values as against, say, spiritual values. These are things that we don't all agree upon now, even as it is. We inhabit a world which is also inhabited by Christians as well as atheists, by cosmopolitans as well as by those who are localists, those who welcome modernization and those who are more traditional. The values that people in the future hold may also turn out to be similarly diverse, but equally they may turn out to be more spiritual and less material, or more material and less spiritual. If we're going to reflect on what justice requires of us in order to make sure that the world of the future serves the interests or the needs or the values of future generations, we have to know something about what it is that will matter to those people in the future. Now, if we were to say, assume that what will matter to them is what matters to us now, it remains the case that what matters to us now is a matter of great variety. We don't agree on whether we want to preserve religion or eliminate it. We don't agree on whether what's most important are certain spiritual values or certain ethical values, or whether what matters most is simply achieving greater happiness through a succession of pleasurable encounters with the world. We have very, very different conceptions of what makes a good life. Now, if that is the case, what assumption should we make about how people in the future will assume makes for a good life? And if we cannot settle on that question, how can we assume anything useful that's going to help us in deciding what justice requires of us in our treatment of future generations? Now, we could, of course, say that what we should do is inculcate in people in our generation and look into the future the kinds of values that they should hold in the future. But even if this is the case, the problem remains that we ourselves don't agree on what kind of people we should create in the future. We don't, for example, agree on whether or not the people of the future should be the people who inhabit the same nations that exist now, or whether we are indifferent to whether nations that don't exist now will come into existence in the future, or whether nations that exist now disappear, as most nations in the history of the world have. If we can't answer any of these questions, it's unclear how we can say that the treatment of people in the future, or our provision for people in the future, should be a matter of justice. None of this, again, should take away from our adopting certain fairly commonsensical attitudes to our immediate descendants. We know that our immediate descendants will probably share, at least within our own local environments, values that are similar to our own. We may want to promote a certain tolerance, given that we know there's disagreement among our contemporaries. But beyond that, beyond looking after each other, this generation and in the one to come, it is difficult to see how we can make the claims of future generations, if they indeed could make claims upon us, a matter of justice. We'd have to be a lot clearer about what's valuable, but what we think is valuable and what the future thinks is valuable if we're going to go down that path. So justice is not the ideal that should guide our treatment of future people unless we know that they will be like us or think we should make them like us, assuming what is, I think, ultimately false, that we are all alike in what we value for the present and the future. That brings me then to the third respect in which we might think about the way in which the language of justice is used to address ethical issues. And this is in the issue not of past injustice or future injustice or justice. It's rather a matter of thinking about justice not within the confines of our own society, but as something that's of concern more widely at the global level. Global justice has been an issue in political theory for some 30 or 40 years now, ever since John Rawls made justice central to moral reflection in political philosophy. Some of his earliest critics suggested that the weakness of Rawls's theorizing lay in the fact that he attempted to develop a theory of justice suitable for a single society. He asked, what are the principles of justice for a good society? And by that, he understood, for the most part, a single nation state. But what some of his critics suggested was that the principles that he devised should ultimately be principles that applied not just to a single society, but to the world as a whole. We must ask the question, what does justice require of us, not just as citizens of a particular country, but as people in the world? And therefore, what does it require of us when it comes to thinking about how we design the institutions that govern the world, how we design the policies that shape interaction between peoples in the world, and shape the way in which goods and bads are distributed. Now, once again, the problem that we face in trying to address this issue as an issue of justice is that we are fundamentally in disagreement about the content or the requirement of justice. Our ethical views are diverse, they are plural. And this is not just because we disagree about justice in itself, but because we disagree about the importance of some of those fundamental values that lie at the heart of our relations with one another. We disagree about what matters when it comes to resources, when it comes to religion, when it comes to how we should appreciate and deal with nature more generally. We also globally have different understandings of property. We have different understandings of the relationship between citizens and rulers. We have different ethical differences on very specific issues, whether they're issues like abortion and infanticide, issues like euthanasia. We have differences over when children become adults. We have differences over the kinds of responsibilities children have to their parents. With these differences so significant, is it possible to develop a kind of standard of justice that will guide us in thinking about how we should distribute the goods and bads of the world across an entire globe? Is it possible for us to develop standards that are going to be widely accepted as the basis upon which justice will be done in a way that everyone accepts? If it's not possible, then the alternative is to say that any efforts we make will be successful or not successful, not because we have failed or succeeded in solving the problem of establishing the right conception of justice, but simply because any outcome will be just a reflection of political power. To look at this a little bit more closely, let me consider the arguments of two philosophers who've suggested ways in which we should think about reforming the global order in order to make it more consistent with the demands or requirements of justice. One of those is the philosopher Alan Buchanan, in an important book some years ago called Justice, Legitimacy, and Self-Determination. And the other is a philosopher, Thomas Pogge, who's written extensively on the duty of justice to resolve problems of global poverty. In Buchanan's case, what he suggested is that what we need to do in order to address issues of global justice, of international justice, is restructure global institutions. We should recognize that the institutions as they operate serve the interests of particular societies better than they do the interests of others. If this is the case, then there is a natural duty of justice to try to fix this, to make sure that these global institutions are reformed in accordance with justice. Now, I would hesitate to suggest that our existing institutions, globally speaking, are perfect or not in need of reform. But whether or not we can reform them in accordance with norms of justice is another matter. The problem here is that any reform of global institutions will have to take account of the basic realities of not only economic, but also political power in the contemporary world. The world is made up not only of individuals, but also of communities, groups, and traditions, and most importantly of states that are of different size, and most importantly of all, of different degrees of power. If global institutions are to be restructured, what is the prospect of that restructuring serving not the interests of the most powerful, but the interests of everyone more generally, and perhaps of the least well-off in particular? It seems to me that the opportunity for this is very slim. But even if we took this aside, the question is, to what extent is it likely that we will in fact converge upon a theory that all are likely to accept as a theory that does justice to the interests of all parties concerned in the world, whether we think of those parties as individuals or those parties as individual states or associations of some other kind, to the extent to which even within states there are disputes about the justice of the settlement of political power and the distribution of a range of things, including resources. If it seems unlikely that justice can be done because of these reasons, because we cannot settle on a conception of justice that will be widely accepted, and because even if we could, the matter is undoubtedly going to be settled by the force of the most powerful. To pursue justice as the ideal that should guide our reflections seems at best highly optimistic. But one of the more practical proposals put forward by the philosopher Thomas Pogge, who suggested that at least what we should be able to do is address one form of fundamental injustice at the global level, which is the issue of global poverty. And here, Pogge has suggested that we take a fairly pragmatic step in trying to establish something like a global resource dividend, a fund that might be used to do justice, both because it pulls together the resources necessary to be made available to poorer nations so that they can lift themselves out of poverty, and at the same time to do justice by redistributing what was unjustly, Pogge's terms, taken from those who are entitled to a fairer share of the world's bounty. Should one think of this issue in terms of justice, and justice in terms of unequal access to resources, or rather injustice in terms of unequal access to resources? In this particular case, the problem that arises is that the claim that Pogge wants to make, that those who have enjoyed much lesser a degree of access to the world's resources, is one that not only is not accepted within the richer or wealthier nations, but also one that's difficult to sustain given the diversity of standards of living within all countries, and given that the agents in question would be either the recipients of redistribution or the ones responsible for supplying the wealth for that redistribution, are at best unclear, and at worst it may be the case that transfers of wealth will not go from rich to poor, but from some rich to other rich, or at worst from the whole to those who are wealthy in other parts of the world. Now, some of this is clearly a matter of practicality. How difficult must it be to ensure an equitable distribution of the world's wealth when the whole of human history has tended towards an outcome in which this wealth is very unequally distributed? At this point, it's no wonder that theorists like Pogge are understandably outraged at what can only be called, he thinks, an injustice. But at this point, it's not clear that anything much is added by calling this a matter of justice, rather than simply saying, there is poverty in the world. It is something that needs to be addressed. What's added by saying that this is a matter of justice? What further incentive does this supply anyone? In what way does this strengthen the case of those who are mired in poverty? Now, one answer to this will be to say, well, the moral imperative is greater once we use the language of justice. And maybe that is the case, at least for some, that once you invoke the language of justice, it sounds like the claim is a much stronger one than if it's merely a claim about the importance of doing good. But at the same time, using the language of justice also raises the stakes in another way. It makes people less likely to think, yes, I should give up what I've got, because what's being claimed from me is something that is asking of me not simply goodwill or humanity, but is something that's looking to be taken from me on the basis of a claim of some wrongdoing on my part. If people reject the idea that they have done wrong or are somehow the wrongful recipients of gains, they might be less likely to look favorably at the kinds of proposals that Thomas Pogge has. Once again, there's no reason to think that somehow turning an issue into a matter of justice will make the resolution of certain problems any more certain. And this is, even if one assumes what is surely false, that we will in fact come to some agreement on what justice is. And the thing about something like justice is that if it's not something that's the outcome of general agreement about what is and is not right, then it can only mean that the outcome, which is asserted to be just, will be enforced, put in place by those who are stronger. And that idea goes very much against the ideal of justice. Let me then draw this lecture to a close by offering some more general reflections on the ideal of justice and its place in our thinking. I've generally tried to suggest that there are two objections to, or rather two obstacles to achieving justice. On the one hand, there is disagreement. And this is disagreement not only about justice, but also disagreement that stems from the diversity of values that we hold. Secondly, I've tried to suggest that an obstacle to achieving justice is the reality of power. That is not just economic power, but also political power. Contemporary political philosophy has focused extensively on the desirability of justice and focused on this extensively on the assumption that the diversity we see in the world is either not as significant an obstacle to this achievement or is something that can be reconciled. In the end, I think this is an untenable set of assumptions. In the end, I think it trades on either an assumption that we are all somehow the same, or by implication, tries to make us all the same. I think failing to appreciate the extent to which power is a problem, and failing to recognize the extent to which diversity is a substantial part of human life, goes some way to explaining why so much emphasis has been placed on trying to see the world through the lens of justice. But it also seems to me that this is part of the reason why political philosophy has continued to pursue a much less fruitful course of inquiry than it might do otherwise. Now, if all of this is true, what is to be done? There are two aspects to this question, which has a practical dimension as well as a philosophical one. The practical question is what is to be done about important issues such as care of the environment or poverty within our own societies and across the world. In this regard, it seems to me that at the practical level, there is no reason why we shouldn't simply continue to address these questions, which are more or less universally understood to be problems that need addressing. Very, very few people think that the care of the environment is a matter to which we should be indifferent. And perhaps even fewer think that poverty is not something to be alleviated. The badness of poverty is sufficient reason for addressing it, and we do not need the claim that it is unjust in order to address it, nor we need to go so far as some theorists have said, or have gone to suggest that the fact that poverty is an injustice means that the poor would be justified in exercising violence to claim what is rightfully theirs. But that is an implication, logically, of a very strong claim that justice is something that cannot be evaded, and once it's established, must be done no matter what. So there's no reason, even if one abandons the language of justice, not to speak out against wrongs, not to debate issues of right and wrong, nor is there even reason not to use the language of justice for certain things, because injustices are undoubtedly committed all the time. But there's no reason to make justice the touchstone for all of our moral reflections in the political realm. Thank you.